venture capital is an illiquid asset class, right? Like even I think there's no expectation, so to speak, by year 5. There are rarely opportunities to even sell, and the only opportunities you get to sell are in your winners, and then if you start selling, you cap your upside effectively.
Yes, I mean if you have a company that's running by if you haven't. The other thing is, this is a bit okay. We're now going to do the logistics of LP land. I hopefully this is interesting and not painfully geeky.
Superclusters is the podcast to demystify the secrets, stories, and tactics behind the money that moves the venture capital world. I want to give a short introduction of who you are, and I'm sure they've seen you everywhere across like Twitter and LinkedIn, and as well as OpenLP. But as a short in quotes introduction, Beezer Clarkson is a partner at Sapphire Partners, leading LP investments in domestic and international funds, which we'll be sure to dive into how how Sapphire thinks about portfolio construction. I promise we're going to go deep. And please, my audience, Beezer, hold me to that promise as well. Sapphire Partners is also one of the 3 verticals in which like Sapphire team is allocating into. The other, including growth stage, startup investing, as well as sports tech. Let me know if I'm off the mark there. And prior to Sapphire, Beezer broke in her pair of LP shoes at DFJ, Omidyar Network, and you've also spent time on the operating side at Hewlett Packard. And also, on top of all that, a banker and a consultant as well. And as I'm saying this out loud, I actually kind of realized that if careers for business-minded individuals happen to be infinity stones that Thanos was going around collecting, you were collecting all of them. I don't know if that was intentional, but you were collecting all of them. And you also run a phenomenal community called OpenLP, which I'm a personal huge fan of, which if we have time to cover today, we'll cover. But I'm going to preface this fact that I know for a fact that I'd love to have Hermione's time turner by the end of this conversation to ask you more, because we're not going to have enough time for everything. On top of all that, if that wasn't enough, Beezer, you're also on the board of directors at the National Venture Capital Association, as well as an advisor to the investment committee at Wesleyan University. And that's just all the tip of the iceberg. I could go on for ages, and this whole podcast is just be me like listing your accolades. But Beezer, welcome to the show.
Thank you. That's very, very kind. I would say one of the great benefits of being older is that you do have a longer time to do things. So some of this is just the allowance of age. But thank you very much.
I think you've done a lot. I think you've put really good use to the years you've spent in the tech world and the VC world and the LP world. And I can't say every person in the world, and even for myself, I can't say I spent every year as well as I would like. But we can go in a million places, and obviously there's tons of meat to chew on here. But I want to start somewhere where we invoke the name Ellen Levy. So I imagine most people might not know this, but who was she, and how did she play a pivotal role in your life?
Yeah, well, I love that you found her in my history. I hope everybody has somebody like Ellen in their life, because she took a bet on me when I was like unknown. I was in business school, and I was on the East Coast, and I was trying desperately to get back to the West Coast. And as cool as being a banker and a consultant might sound to the uninitiated, it meant bupkis in 2099 when I wanted to be in tech and BD in the West Coast. And they're like, yeah, do not care. And connected with her through a friend of a friend. I mean, she really just took such a wild bet on me. And literally, she didn't know me. We had a phone call through a friend. And she said, sure, why don't you come out and be my intern? She was at Corp Dev for a startup, which was a very, very precursor to the iPad today. It was not an Apple company, but it was sort of a handheld reader stylus thing. And she'd been very well ingrained in Silicon Valley, knew a ton of people, and just mentored me and opened the door and made a series of just incredible introductions and just allowed me to follow her around, which at the time was just game changing and has continued on. Like, there was a period of time in my life, and now, unfortunately, my career sort of taken me a slightly different direction, but there was a huge amount of time where pretty much all roads led to Ellen. Like, she's responsible for my next 3 jobs to jump forward. Because she probably still does, knows everybody. So every time I'd come to her and be like, hey, I'm thinking about XYZ, and it'd been like 3 or 4 years, she's like, oh, I know so-and-so. And here's a couple thoughts. Or, oh, they're hiring. Or, oh, yeah. So I wish everybody has the fairy godmother that Ellen has been in my life. So I just always say I'm grateful and thank her.
She sounds incredible. And for those who don't know, she eventually held, I believe, an executive as well as advisory position at LinkedIn as well. On
Yes.
top of doing multiple other things. But I want to actually backtrack.
So just a shout out, she was
Go for
early
it. Go
corp
for it.
dev. She ran corp dev at LinkedIn, and is now running. She's a very active angel, great angel, very thoughtful investor. But amongst her many different roles where she did corp dev, LinkedIn was one of them.
That's amazing. But I actually do want to double click on something, and it's too good of a nugget not to double click on. Where you mentioned she took a bet on you. Feel free to leave this up, like some of it to speculation, because obviously you might be speaking as if you were her. But what do you think made you, despite being a banker and a consultant and all these amazing things, what do you think stood out? Because I imagine for someone her caliber, she was also like, she could have mentored so many other individuals. She could have helped so many other individuals. What about you at that point in time do you think like sold it to her?
It's a really good question. I feel probably better answered by her, so I should have emailed her to ask. But I think I'd like to say there's some of it where maybe she saw, I think bankers and consultants do not lack for skills, despite the fact that a lot of people in tech were like, you're not a product manager, you don't do product, therefore, how are you useful? I think because she was in corp dev, some of the analysis, some of the financial capabilities were relevant for what she was doing. I would expect somebody did the same thing for her. And so I think sometimes it's we take advantage of the ability to pay it forward or pay it back or pay it in all directions. I would like to think, although honestly, I cannot remember what I wrote or said to her, that I came prepared and showed up. And I do tell people all the time, if you want to do an informational interview with someone, like it's incumbent upon you to tell them why they should care, and not the like, hey, David, I think I want to be an LP. Will you please get on the phone and spend 6 hours of your life to tell me about it? And I haven't done any homework. Not saying you and I get emails like that, but a little bit. Or David, I've read 6 of your posts and I've watched 3 of your podcasts. And there was a really, what you did for me on these questions. I would like to think I did that for her, but honestly, it was so many years ago.
That makes sense. Well, if we were to analogize that, because later you found yourself at OMDR Networks that we mentioned before, Pierre, he's been on the record saying that, like I quote, and I don't want to misquote here, but I had really high standards and I often felt other people weren't meeting them. And of course, over the years, he's morphed his philosophy and all that in terms of talent. And he's obviously gone on to like do incredible things, right? But what do you think was a skill set, experience, or the story you told him when you made your first foray into the LP side of the world?
I was having dinner with Ellen. I mean, I kid you not. Like, she's just this wonderful, magic, sparkly thing that happened to me. And I was at Hewlett Packard at the time, and I was doing business development. I'd finally gotten like my job doing business development is very exciting for software, for get this, desktops and laptops. Like, people used to pay to put their software on it and their icon on it. I know.
I've never heard of that.
I know. And we were doing a lot of work in international markets. I was getting very intrigued. I'd always been intrigued by international markets and how software was developing and the tech center was developing. Prior to HP, I'd been at a venture capital company that had essentially given all its money back, which is not the same thing as failing, but it came through the dot-com bubble. And then in 2000, 2001, decided the best thing to do is to give back the LP money and to shut down. And I reference these two things because Ellen, of course, because she knows everybody, was like, oh, hey, someone I know and think really highly of works at this firm called Omidyar Network, and he runs the investing group. And here's what they're doing, which is essentially looking to hire folks to help expand technology's reach in emerging markets to connect financial services. And I was like, that's so funny. I just saw this job posting on my business school website and I applied. And so it was like this weird serendipity. And so when I ended up interviewing and I got the job and I came back around and I asked the hiring manager, who was not her friend, but the person in between. So it was like Pierre, Ellen's friend, my boss.
Gotcha.
and I asked them and I said, you must have been like inundated with resumes. Like, how did all this sort? And I say this because the point of this is you never know. Sometimes doors close, a window's open. My hiring manager said, listen, you obviously had all the skill sets from various things to understand financial acumen, but you'd been at this venture fund and you'd done this other work at HP, and it was a VC that was different from the other place because everyone else in the Bay Area was applying for which more of a traditional Bay Area resume, and I had this New York VC on my resume. And even though the venture fund essentially closed / again, I don't want to say the word failed because I think that's just not the right term. I think it was a very brave thing to do to shut down and give back the capital. That actually to her was what was the most important thing. And at the time when I left, I was like, ooh, I don't know how this is going to turn out. Like that wasn't the trajectory that we thought. So yes, so you never know. everything in your background is be a part of who you are and is all important. So that's what, long story short.
I love it. And oftentimes when we live life, I think it may seem rocky, chaotic in foresight. And obviously, like when people talk about it in interviews and on resumes, things make a lot more sense in hindsight. It might not always be the narrative we initially set it out for it to be, but at the same time, we've picked up lessons, scar tissue along the way that help us create the person that we are today. And in my experience, and don't get me wrong, this was like last year. I was a freaking nobody, and I reached out to you, and I was like, hey, you know what? Beezer would love your thoughts on this blog post, and you've been like so kind in that. And I think I don't know how much of it this is like paying it forward, but also I've just been incredibly grateful for all our conversations.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if you've read it recently, but Paul Graham just wrote this incredible article post. I think it's called How to Do Great Work.
Oh yeah, it is by far his longest blog post to date. But it's, I mean, usually I see these things and I'm like, oh, you know what? There's probably only like 2 paragraphs worth of like good tidbits to go on. And I don't know if he meant it to be this way, but I read it all in one sitting, and it was by far some like the best like short narrative, short story novella, so to speak, that I've read about how to be ambitious and do good work.
Same. And I loved it because you said it so much more nicely and gently than I say it about myself in my head, but I felt my career's kind of got a bit like this. And I didn't actually feel like, and this is, I can talk for hours about why I love Sapphire, but I didn't really feel like it gelled in this collective until I started at Sapphire doing the LP work. But his whole comment about pursue the interesting and what you're curious about has been the trend line I've always followed. And when you peel it back, it's always been incredibly consistent. It's just come in these very different wrappers. I just felt very seen. Half the time you see people that have these incredibly straight careers and you can get very far very fast being focused. And I'm like, well, what if you need to do a little of this and a little of this?
I mean, even anecdotally, I would say some of my favorite investors, founders, they all come from different backgrounds. And like some of my favorite investors, they're history majors, right? Chris, who's on our last episode, he was a kind of like of that pedigree as well, right? And he got really big into history, and I'm sure like there's a lot more there. But it's approaching the world in not just one set of lens, but multiple perspectives, multiple angles to look at the same thing. And what it reminds me of is I had this sixth grade teacher, and I don't want this to be too much of myself because the goal is to feature you here. But one of my sixth grade teacher once told me it is better to solve a one math problem 5 different ways than to solve 5 different problems one way. And for people with different backgrounds, who come from this windy serpentine path, so to speak, are empowered and armed with perspectives that you can't get by just sticking in like, you know, I know in the venture world we use the swim lane analogy a lot, and having been a former swimmer, I'm like, actually I jumped around between swim lanes all the time. But
that intersectionality I think is what makes the LP world so interesting.
Oh yeah.
Again, this is a bias because it's me talking about my own life, but I think it makes you a better investor. Because if it is not just yourself, like our team has different perspectives, and it's really, really helpful because you need to. It's a blind pool of capital, so who knows what's going to happen? I mean, literally, you don't know. It's like, here, David, here's some money, go and invest. And the LPA is a very light superstructure within which the decisions will be made, shall we say? So you don't know. So understanding all the possibilities of who you are and what you like, and what the macro looks like is very important, which. Yes, so I think all those things contribute to being a good investor.
I think so. I think it's a lot of. So I'm an angel investor, and I spend a lot of time like talking to founders as well, and I'll constantly have to remind myself, obviously having like spending a lot of time investing consumer, that I am not always the final customer, right? Like just because they're pitching to me doesn't mean I'm the consumer, the customer, the user that they're aiming for. And at the same time, I'm reminded by a conversation I had with Eric Bond, one of my favorite people in the world, where they're at a fund 3 now, and they tried to convince an LP, which I ended up sharing in a blog post as well, so I guess I can say it publicly. But Foundry Group, they were like Eric and Elizabeth were trying to pitch Foundry Group for the longest time, and Foundry was like, I don't see where you guys are going. We don't agree with this. But the consistency in updates, but also the transparency in how they arrived at that conclusion with regular LP updates, and just being like, this is our perspective into the world. You may not agree, but this is a strategy in which like it is, you know, it's not going to change too much. And then eventually like, Foundry ended up becoming one of their largest anchor LPs, even though initially they started off in disagreement in terms of fund strategy, which I find like, I think it goes back to like, if you can entertain multiple perspectives as an LP, that is a superpower altogether.
I agree. And I also think we might be skipping ahead on your schedule, so apologies in advance.
And the whole purpose of this, we go off schedule all the time.
Oh,
and I say all the time because you're the second recording, so all the time.
All the time. Yes, 100%, apparently.
100%.
I do, because someone asked me this question before, and I saw it in your notes too, which is like kind of what makes for the why should there be another venture fund? What brings you back to the table? If somebody presents a compelling viewpoint, it could be the same one you've had in your mind that you're like, yes, I've been waiting for this to occur. Like it felt like there was this space in the world. Or it could be something where you're like, I disagree. And yet you're somehow showing me there's more possibility out there than I had anticipated. And things you kind of can't get out of your head when people leave the room. And it's not just the euphoria of some charismatic conversation, but you wake up the next week and you're like, I'm still wondering about what they said. For me, that's a great hook.
I'm with you. I'm like, there are things that like founders or GPs bring back to the, like they tell you, and then you bring back to the dinner table. Like I have these conversations with my spouse who has like nothing to do with the world of venture at all. And both she and I just like ponder it for a while. And she's like, oh, that is provocative. That makes you think, right? And those kinds of resonations are interesting. I'm not saying this guarantees an LP investment, but you live rent free in people in LP's minds. And actually, I think you touched on something. Like, we'll just jump straight to this. And one of the big questions I always have, at least for GPs, is, and I'm sure like for people much smarter than me, like yourself, which is in this panacea of capital. Like, there's thousands of like seed stage firms that were created over the past couple of years. But the question is like, why does another venture fund need to exist? There's so much capital out there. And so for me, I think when I ask that question, either like explicitly or implicitly, like it's a great way to understand competitor landscape from a GP's own self-awareness. And obviously you don't want to hear like, we have no competitors, but I'm actually curious.
No, but you do hear that. And then you're like,
you do hear you do hear that. You don't want to hear that, right? But you do hear that. And it happens way more. I mean, the same thing with founders, right? They're like, we're in an N of one kind of sample size, and I'm like, like even if it's not direct competitors or indirect competitors and their incumbent habits, and I invest in consumer, but they may not be direct competitors, but you're fighting for attention, and there's only 24 hours in a day and 16 hours are awake, so you're fighting for attention from something else. There's always competitors, right? Anyways, I'm curious from your perspective, because you've seen so many GP pitch decks, right? Do you recall any memorable answers to the differentiation question?
So I realized I should ask your question, because I don't ask that exact question. I don't ask the like, why should you exist? But maybe one should, because it's a very direct, it gets directly to the heart of it. I think it goes back to what I said before. I'm trying to think of a different way of saying it, which is when someone pitches you and you're like, well, why are the entrepreneurs going to care? Right? Mm-hmm. They're always going to be happy there's more money. Who doesn't want more money? VCs are always happy when another LP rolls into town, because who doesn't want more capital to be available? But it again goes to the, like, when someone says something and you're like, oh, I get why, what you're doing, right? Like, why you're here.
Right.
And why you're here is going to be, is not only just going to be relevant for me at LP. I think you understand the business of venture, so you're going to be a fiduciary. But on the other side, the entrepreneurs are going to pick you, because that also probably has to exist first. I mean, I know they need the money from LPs to make it work, but if you can't win the best deals, you're not going to return a lot of capital. You're not going to have great funds. Eventually you'll peter out. So the entrepreneur connection has to be there, and there's just too much availability of cap. I know a lot of entrepreneurs don't feel like there's enough capital, so I appreciate this sounds hypocritical or naive or worse, but there is so much more venture capital available today than there was in the past. For a great idea, it should be funded, but a great idea that needs to be able to pick what you, the VC, right? And right. Why do we believe that is so? Like, what are you seeing about the world? Who are you as a person? Who are you as a firm? How are you going to compete with everybody else? So I've never heard like a 2-line sentence that you're like, done. It's more of the, here's who we are, here's our body of work.
That makes a lot of sense. Actually, speaking of like how they see the world, and obviously that part of this requires some level of access to deal flow. I actually want to touch on something you so graciously shared this last year when I asked you for the Emerging LP Playbook. You said a very provocative line that I was like, it's one of those things I came back to the dinner table with my partner and I was like, I know what every word in this sentence means, but putting it all together, I am like, I can see where it's going, but I want to hear from, and I've been saving this question off for all these months to ask you now, which is, you said this line, which was, it's not about proprietary deal flow, but it's about proprietary access to great deals. Like, I'm just curious, can you elaborate on that? Like, why does the word access mean so much more than just quote unquote proprietary deal flow?
Well, when I started in venture, which keep in mind was 1999, 2000, so has a couple of years on it, you could probably argue that there was proprietary deal flow.
Okay.
And it came out of, I don't know, whatever it was. You had an incubator, accelerator. You were the only one that worked with XYZ cohort of people. Was it really, really 100% proprietary? Maybe not. But you could just see that there was swim lanes, to use your word, or there was so few. Silicon Valley was closed in many ways. Like, if you didn't know the VC, getting in there was just going to be really hard. Twitter wasn't the same thing, or Threads or whatever. So that existed. And I think the evolution of venture is that it is much more porous, which is all a good thing, right? But the downside is it's really hard to go to, like, even what, let's just pick on YC because they're fit, because it's fun and they're awesome, so they'll take it, right?
Right.
Which VC has proprietary only access, like, or deal flow only from YC? I mean, maybe back in the day it was true because Sequoia did the startup fund, and I have no idea if that meant it was monolithic and they could get all of it. But there was avenues where there was, you had fewer people at the table. Now, when people go to the YC demo day, they have to kind of duke it out, I assume, with everybody else who's there. And so it's the access and why do the great people pick you that is much harder. And that speaks to this, like, what is it that you, the investor, are bringing to the table? And there's an LP-GP corollary to this too, right? That the strongest GPs can pick their LPs. And so what gives the access on the LP side? So it's really a different way of saying, like, why are you so special? But it's repeatable in some cases because you see this, right? That some investors just get this great access where other people get kind of shut out. People say it nicely. They say it's adverse selection, but that basically means you don't have access to the top deals as defined by future exit potential or the ultimate exit, right? Because it's a little hard to know day one who's going to be a best deal. Or if you do know, that's awesome and you're going to be a great investor. But the rest of us humans have to wait.
I'm still figuring that out. So if any of our listeners have the answer to that there's I will definitely reply to that email. I'm sure you will as well. That comes that way. It's like, we found the secret sauce. Here's what it is. Speaking of special, and this may be a more jarring turn than I expect it to, but I want to fulfill a promise to our audience because we've hit snooze on this for way too long, which is I want to really dive deep into, like, how you think as an LP, right? And we'll start with your team. We'll start with Sapphire. One of the things I find fascinating about working on an A+ team is really the diversity of backgrounds and opinions and possible processes that really create a robust execution engine. At Sapphire, you work with Laura, who comes from, I think, 17 years in counting, the institutional LP side. And then you also have Nate, who spent time in marketing and operations, just to name two of many others on your team, right? And of course, there were your teammates at DFJ and OBDR Network and more. Have you ever worked with someone who's approached LP investing in an orthogonal way to compared to your own? And what was the most challenging and intriguing part about reaching a conclusion with that person, if there is one?
You're talking about an individual versus a co-investor that has just a really different
individual on a team, so to speak.
We're a little orthogonal, but it's hugely complementary, and they are still in the Sapphire team, and I am just so grateful every single day. For me, it's very important to be able to understand the air that the investees are breathing. So, David, if you're like in the Bay Area, well, I spent a lot of time there, so that's not as great an example. But let's say you were
Damn it, I should have been in like the Bahamas or like Cayman Islands.
When we started investing in Israel, right? It was a geography I'd not spent time in prior to coming to Sapphire. I, of course, could read about it and do all those things, but we made multiple trips over the first few years that we were working there to meet people, to understand the lay of the land, entrepreneurs, VCs, LPs, the whole kit and caboodle. Because for me, I needed to be able to understand what the entrepreneurs were seeing and feeling, to then understand the VC landscape, to then make our decisions. I have a colleague who literally can just read the numbers and be like, oh, it looks like XYZ is happening. I'm like, how the hell do you do that? And it's it's his superpower, and it's awesome, and it's great. And I can speak to Laura and Nate. Everyone does have these different ways of doing it, and it's wonderful because you do need all those parts, because there's things that I'll pick up on, and there's things that they'll pick up on, and sometimes it's like the Olympic circles. Like there's a lot of overlap, but everybody has their own little sections. And it's not that I can't read the numbers and be like, oh, look, the TVPI is dependent on 3 companies and whatever, but like they can literally do this cold without meeting the people. And for me, and for a lot of the team, the people are such an important component because of the blind capital. Like that intuition, or it's probably more science than intuition. Anyway, that's a really interesting skill that we're really grateful to have.
I'm not going to let you get away with that answer in just a sec, because I'm curious if I'm sure there are times when any of you or others have disagreed with each other. And I'm curious on like the process of how you reached a conclusion despite disagreeing, maybe if you should put dollars behind an emerging manager or someone else.
We do have the flexibility in our process. If somebody is really adamant that there's allowance for one person having a super high conviction. Mm-hmm. That said, if everybody else is like hells to the no, we'd rather quit than make this investment, like that has to be acknowledged. So because part of it is the obligation of being able to express why you're interested.
Okay.
Like you can't just say, I want to invest in David. All of you, doesn't matter, you don't like his investments, right? Not personal. Like we don't have
right.
Like I have to be able to make the argument, even if people are saying like, I don't have as much conviction that, SaaS in the future is going to have the same returns that David's been able to produce in the past. Like you still have to be able to lay out the argument. And that's part of why we run the process the way we run it, mm-hmm. because it is the act of communicating it that helps explain why people care, because it's not a unilateral decision-making system. So we do a lot of that. And also we try to unearth a lot of questions in advance, because it's also core teamwork. If you come down to the last bit of the process and people are like, oh yeah, no, we're a no. Like it shouldn't be that shouldn't be in the 12th inning. It's not fair to the GP. It's not fair to our team. So we do a lot of work to surface things in advance. We do, and a shout out to all our GPs that work with us on this. We like having multiple people on the team get exposure over different time. So different people might go to the annual meeting, different people, because you can't always roll up with a team of 6 in an annual meeting. We get that.
That's true.
It's
very intimidating.
Virtually we could, but there's space capacities. But we do like this because, and I'm sure it's a different version of the VC and the entrepreneur, you want everyone at the VC to know who you are, so that you can ask to talk to anybody about anything, but also if David's unavailable for a day, you don't want to be stranded. Right. You want to have multiple people understand you. So we try very hard to do that. And that also, I think, helps with the understanding, even if everyone doesn't always see the exact same potential. Mm-hmm. Everybody at least has some level of exposure and experience.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, and I do want to touch on something that you mentioned, which is Israel and just portfolio construction from an LP standpoint as well. But before we get to that, I'm curious about something that you just mentioned, right? Like, not everyone has to jump into like an annual meeting or like, with the GP at a given point. One, it might be intimidating. Two, space capacity and all that, right? So how long does the process take when you go from initial meeting with the GP to we're going to invest in you on average? And then 2, when each person shows up, do they have some sort of agenda they have in mind that they need, like a question they need to have answered before they walk out, or is it more laissez-faire?
The question about how long we know people, I have all the feels on, because there's situations where we've known people for 5 or 7 years, mm-hmm. and the intersectionality of what they're doing from an investing standpoint and us, just it happens when it happens. Partially that's because we launched focusing on Series A. We've expanded to include some seed and pre-seed. So there are some managers that we are very, very grateful to be involved with. But at the time, until they moved a bit more to Series A, it just was outside of our focus area. Like, could we turn back the clock and do seed then? Yes. But so there's some of those where but saying that does not make a GP be like, yay, go Sapphire. I want to wait 7 years to work with you. So I'm cognizant of the message that sends, but I'm just saying sometimes these situations occur, right? Uh-huh. And it used to be that LPs would say, we'd like to get to know you when you're not fundraising and through a cycle. And when fundraising is a year, does that really equate to the same thing? Most LPs back in the day meant really more like 2 to 3 years. Do we try to get our homework done in advance? Like, we try to do all the things. I would say we try to make our process work with the GPs whenever possible. And if we think we're not going to make a cycle, we try to be cognizant of that early on. And could we always improve? Yes. Like, we're not claiming that we're perfect, but we do try to know if we don't think we can get there in time to bow out fast and to move with the speed that's presented to us. That's not always possible. The reality is there are only 24 hours in a day, and you want everyone to feel like they're the highest and most important thing. But it's like any portfolio, there's multiple demands at the same time. And so to your other point about, do we have agendas? We try to be very respectful of the time that we take. So there's times when we have for meetings, and it really is I just want to spend time and hear how you are doing, David. Like, that is the agenda. Let's go sit and talk about how you are. There's other times when it's, David, let's walk through your value drivers and understand the health of the companies. And here's the 4 things we're really looking to know. And we try to send those questions enough in advance that this is not something you need to produce in 2 minutes, because that is unfair. So the overriding idea is to know why we're in the room, and then to give you the information that you need so it's useful for you. So it can be any range of those.
Gotcha. So you're not trying to blindside any GPs out there. It is a collaborative process.
Is that a skill? Is that not a skill? Is that a technique? I mean,
I don't condone it. Don't get me wrong, but I know of LPs who have just been like, I want to see how they think about not intentionally in the sense of like making them look bad, but I want to see how people think on their feet. And I don't know if like necessarily VC is an asset class that needs for people to think on their feet. I mean, I can see this for founders. Like there might be a black swan event that may really impact revenue, or like how you maintain servers or whatnot, right? But I don't know. Like I like prefacing the idea of like prefacing questions and topics beforehand, so VCs can put their best foot forward, and how they think about things on their best behavior effectively.
Well, I would say what we really like, so shout out to any VC listening, we like to get decks in advance, because what I found to be the most productive meeting is not you explaining your fund to me for the very first time and seeing what our cold response is, but let us see it in advance, because A, if it's not a fit, I should tell you up front and not waste your time. And B, then we can come back with much more useful questions and have a real discussion, or a realer discussion on whatever it is that we want to dig in on, versus having you read me slides. Like, presumably we can do that on our own. It's sort of like the flipped classroom for kids. I just feel like this is a much better use of our time and your time. So we do ask people all the time, and some folks would rather walk you through the deck, but we would really rather get in advance. P.S. in an email, not a doc send, or doc send with a downloadable capability, because it's very hard to share amongst the team.
That's fair.
And again, this is all in the camp of proprietary and confidential should be assumed, but you want us to be able to compare, like to send it around and be prepared.
That makes a lot of sense. I think GPs should just send out decks under the assumption it will be shared. I think the same thing is true for founders, like under the assumption it will be shared. So you shouldn't have too much proprietary information on there, if at all, but you should, like, a person reading it should get a good lay of the land for what you're all about. I'm curious from an LP perspective, just because this podcast is for LPs and all that, when you receive the deck prior to the meeting, are there items in the deck or slides that your eyes immediately zoom in on that you specifically look out for? And you can say this in correlation with what Sapphire looks for in particular. So this may not apply to all LPs, but I'm curious if that is something you do look for.
Sure. There's different people on our team will look for different things, but I would say overall, we do want to know who the team is. We want to know what fund you're raising, vintage number, fund size. We want to know the past vintages and fund sizes. We want to know the high level numbers on the various funds. We like to know the companies that are the main value drivers in them, if it's progressed enough for that to be a thing. Like, hey, we're on fund 3, and in fund 2 and fund 1, here's a couple of them you may have heard of, right? Sometimes people address that with case studies. Like, I think the case studies can be secondary, to be honest. I think the value of the case study is saying, how did you choose who you chose? How did you win? And that can be expressed in multiple ways. Yeah, those are kind of the highlights.
Okay.
And we really do read it. Like, I would like to be able to flip through this and say, I get it. David is raising an early Series A fund. He's targeting $250 million. He's going to do XYZ number of checks. Here's his target ownership. And here's his book of work. High level. Like, you don't have to give me all the goods, because this is an intro meeting, but enough that it's not I don't really know what he's investing in. Because you'd be surprised, right? I'm sure many LPs feel this way, that you're like, software, but I'm not entirely sure. Or how is it different? Like, it's very hard for a fund to be expressed in like a 140 character tweet, but short enough. Like, I think 10 slides should be sufficient to convey it.
I don't know if it's good or bad to have an agenda when you're running a podcast, but there are certain things that I kind of like would love, or like I'm sure our audience would also love to hear about. Which is mainly on the topic of portfolio construction and strategy, which I know you've talked like a lot about, but I want to dig deep on this in this episode. I mentioned we're going to touch back on Israel and all of that. From my knowledge, and feel free to set the record straight here, at Sapphire, you allocate about 70% into US funds, 25% into European funds, and then 5% into Israel. First of all, is this like breakdown directionally correct?
Yes, and we can't. It's because it's blind capital. Things float around a little bit inside the funds and on the underlying company level, but that's generally speaking the high level of what we're targeting.
And then, so based on that, I'm curious, how did you and your team come up with that distribution? Was there more science to behind like why it was like 70% into like U.S. funds instead of 60% or 80%, or was this kind of just the deal flow in which you were seeing?
Well, we started this from day one prior to deal flow, so there was some science and some art, like all great investments in venture. And it was, I would say the science part was looking at where the predominance of, and we're not doing Asia. So it's not that it was lost on us that Asia and Latin America have productivity, but we are a small team. We have a set pool of capital. There is only so many geographies we thought we could cover well. So we picked our geographies, and we can talk about where we missed, but that just is assuming that is what it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then when you look at that, you look at where the tech centers are, and just a little bit of weighing the art and the science of like, well, the predominance of the venture from a productivity, meaning returns basis, happens in the US, right? And even if you're investing in Israeli companies, a lot of them have exited on the US stock market, have had major exits, or have been acquired by US companies. So we had that information to look at. And then you have the idea that we're going in early, right? We're early stage, we invest in early stage venture funds.
Mm-hmm.
So given that, how many of these funds in these different geographies do you need to play with to create the exit set? Because it's different things, which is like, yes, if Israel's going to exit in the US, it probably means a lot of the growth stage capital is coming from other geographies, not just, I'm not picking on Israel. It's just an easier one to say, like, why is it a smaller dollar? Because we end up getting Israeli exposure through our US managers as well, because they'll come in later. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing in Europe. We went in a bit earlier into seed funds in the beginning. Because again, there's now more growth capital resident in Europe, but back when we started out, a lot of the growth capital that went into European companies was really US based.
Right.
It might still be US domiciled, just people with offices. So part of it was looking at this and saying, well, if we're going to get exposure, it's going to grow this way with the US funding follow on. What does that mean for where you want to put the dollars to begin? And we revisit it. There's no hard and fast rule. We compare every dollar has to be productive against the other dollar. There's no different return profiles for different geographies or different funds. We weigh and measure everything the same, but it's worked well for us. Whenever we revisit it, we feel the same.
That makes a lot of sense. And obviously, like as you're investing indirectly into startups, is there the underlying set that you're looking for, like in terms of, because you're allocating 70% to US funds, 25% to European funds, and 5% to Israeli funds, you're looking for maybe a distribution of like 70% US startups, 25% European startups, and 5% Israeli startups? Because you did mention that there might be some overlap in portfolio. And at what point is there too much overlap? Because if they're investing the same underlying asset, that may not mean you're differentiated, or like not differentiated, but diversified.
It's a really interesting question, because we did have a slightly higher exposure in Israel when we started, because the geographies were a bit more constrained, and we did see more, and in Europe, and we've seen more flexibility of where people are investing. Fund sizes have also grown in some geographies, and so people mature out of what our program is. Like, we're not doing a $2 billion fund. That's just, so far, hasn't been our program for early stage. So some of those is understanding who's in your profile and who do you think that the most productive dollar will be. The other thing that kind of comes into play when looking at these is it's a blend between the historical and the future. Mm-hmm. So when you go back and you do like your unicorn exit analysis, it just comes up with the origins of the same places. And I appreciate this can change. And I appreciate COVID made us all reconsider the value of geography, and companies are more distributed than they were in the past. So this could all change. But it just ended up being the same, which doesn't mean to say there can't be a couple great companies that get born in different geographies all the time. But the talent that sits there that can then come in and work in them is not always the same. And again, distributed companies could change this whole entire landscape. But, the first fund I worked at was in New York. It was in 2000. This was on the direct side. And you just Facebook wasn't there. Sorry, Meta, Google wasn't there. Like all these big companies weren't there. So if your company was growing and needed to hire a manager who had taken a company from 100 people to 1,000, you just didn't have that. You didn't have those people. And so that's a thing that we look at. And so you want to invest, you need to balance all of these. And I appreciate you don't want to only invest in what history tells you to do. You have to keep your eye on the future as well. But that's a little bit of what we play with. And honestly, right now it is, I don't know, but I was just reading the PitchBook numbers where you're seeing dollars reaggregate into the Bay Area, New York, versus the rest of the United States, just to talk about the US for a little bit. I suspect this is an AI phenomenon because I haven't been able to pull this out of PitchBook yet, so this could be completely wrong. But my intuition / reading of TechCrunch news and Primac news is the companies that are pulling the big dollars right now are AI, and they're probably headquartered. Whether or not the people work there all the time, I don't know, given the back to office challenges. But sort of Bay Area-ish and New York-ish, and that's why those dollars are spiking versus the rest of the US. And does that then mean the VCs need to be headquartered there to win those deals and have their proprietary access? Probably more yes than no. Because if you're, again, I think at some of the seed stages, there's different headwinds and tailwinds on being local. But if you're really far away, the human nature of this stuff comes into play. If there is proximity value, there is seeing people, there's knowing people.
I can see where that's going. And I think there's a case to be made for folks who are geographically close, because if you think about it for founders, when they think like, oh, I'm about to raise my Series A round, like who are the 5 people I will reach out to first? They're usually folks who are top of mind, who you've seen them recently, and you've had some sort of interaction with them over the last like 6-12 months, or you've seen them in the news somehow, right? And it's so important to stay top of mind. And when you're geographically close, I'm not saying if you're not geographically close, it's impossible, but if you're geographically close, that's another degree of freedom, or axes in which you can increase your exposure for quote unquote luck to stick, or whenever the founder goes like, I need to start fundraising. And so I think it goes back to that proprietary access to deals, right? Because they think of you first, they approach you first, so you can set the terms, you can give them a preemptive term sheet, whatever that means.
And I do think I'm constantly listening to how other people do their business. Like, how much can you? What is the equivalent of like the WhatsApp group? How do you stay present using other means? But I do like, so we're just watching this, which doesn't mean to say we have predetermined ideas about it, but it was just very notable in the Q2 numbers that PitchBook just put out that this was sort of aggregating back into these geos because COVID had this little other distribution that was going on. And from an LP perspective, it just brings up lots of questions like, do you do funds outside these areas? Do you not? How does distributed workforce matter? Again, no answers. Lots of questions. But as an LP, these are all things we consider. And there's a different but similar thing happening in Europe right now too. And then Brexit and all that. It's like all a big mush. But
this is a weighty topic, and I'm sure deserves an episode in and of itself. And so one of the questions, and I kind of prefaced this in our conversation beforehand, and I don't want to lead the witness too much here because I'll be honest, this is an area I plead a large amount of ignorance in. But you've publicly mentioned at Sapphire that you underwrite Series A funds to a 3x net multiple, and for seed funds a 5x. What is the thought process behind that and the modeling that's required to underwrite such an expected return?
I think this is a very consistent thing you'll find in the LP world, but if you're hearing other people doing something else, we love to learn. We look at the fund construction, we break it down and say, we take from what the VC tells us. So this is not math that we don't ground in what they've either been doing or they say they're going to do, and say what needs to be true given the ownership, the going in valuation, the size of the fund itself for this to be a 3x net. you make pretty simple, you just run the numbers and it'll tell you what the exit valuations need to be. And you end up in situations where you're like, okay, given the ownership stake, maybe the median exit value has to be 600 million, or maybe it's 1.2 billion. And you're like, okay, in the area they're looking at, this feels reasonable. And then if they're assuming they're going to get between, I'm making this up, 11 and 17% because it's Series A, you're like, okay, usually people have a narrower target. But somewhere in that zone, call it 15%, that doesn't feel out of market.
Right.
If somebody presents to you a fund where they have, 2% ownership and they want to have 70 companies and it's a $400 million fund, I'm being a little exaggerated here, but you're like, well, what needs to be true to make a 3X fund? And you're like, oh, you need really big exits and you need a lot of them. And then statistically, the odds of this happening are just, it just defies the imagination a bit too much. Right? Because we do a bunch of work on looking at what the historical exits in venture are, and it's not that we can't imagine the world's going to be different. But if we just went through this very large and consistent bull market, and we only had so many $15, $20 billion exits, to look at a fund construction and say you need to have 3 $10 billion exits to make this a 3X fund, and you have no history of doing so. It's different. Like if you're, again, like Sequoia might have a different situation going on here. But for the newer GPs of the world, you're like, well, what are the real odds of this happening? That's how we sort of do the math. I mean, again, it's not anything anybody can't do. You can do it publicly. It's not secret math.
And I'm curious on the world, like most kind of managers start when they run their fund one, they either come from like an angel investor background, they have a track record as an angel investor, or they come from a larger fund. And you'll see some portability of track record there. But let's like kind of like, for kind of the LPs who are looking to invest in like a fund 2, fund 3 and onwards kind of thing, or maybe even like looking at the track record of someone at a larger fund who now decides to start their smaller fund. And what does like a multiple of 3X by the end of the fund sounds great. But sometimes I think it's also really important to think about it as an investor. When and should you start exiting, liquidating some of your equity and your shares before fund close? And one of the metrics I've like heard at least around is that a good DPI, distributions to paid in capital, this is like, as Chris would call it, moolah in the kula, like hold hard cash that you get back, is 1x within the first 5 to 7 years, or between the first 5 to 7 years of the fund. And I'm curious, at least from your perspective as at Sapphire, and let me know if this hits a dead end here and I'll take responsibility of it, is what does meaningful / good DPI and TVPI, and then what does great DPI and TVPI standing for, like total value to paid in capital, which is like everything, the book value of something. What does that look like at year 5 for you? And what does that look like at year 7 and year 10? And obviously, like by the time of fund close, we're already looking at certain multiples.
Well, I want to be in Chris's funds that do a 1x of their fund by year 5.
I will also say Chris was not the person who told me this, but I don't want to oust Chris for the
okay, because I was like, that's pretty strong. Like that is deeply atypical, right? Mm-hmm. Most funds, I would say the typical, and you can Google this, most return profiles, most funds don't start returning meaningful capital until like year 10.
Okay.
Which also goes to like, why are funds 10 years in life? They're really going to be like 15 to 18 reality is, and the distributions will vary as to when they're coming in, but call it year 10 because if it's year 8, that's great. If it's year 12, it's not wildly atypical. So year 5, yeah, we expect to see, feel free to bring it on, but like 0 DPI, which doesn't mean to say funds couldn't be recycling, but you wouldn't expect to see a lot of DPI.
Okay.
So it's 2023. So yeah, if you've got a 2013 to 15 fund, there should be some evidence of productivity coming in. Mm-hmm. But it's right. But I would say like post that, like it's a 2017 or 18 fund, like that's too. Again, it could happen. Like that's awesome. Right. And crypto, because there was such, where we have seen that behavior historically is in the crypto sphere back when you could liquidate so many tokens so quickly, and there was such a deep market for it. So we did see funds getting a lot of DPI much faster than the typical software-based funds or equity-based. But Your crystal ball is better than mine, and whether or not they'll ever happen again, I don't know.
Obviously, the expectations in the last couple of years have inflated, I think, venture as a whole, and venture capital is an illiquid asset class, right? Like even I think there's no expectation, so to speak, by year 5. There are rarely opportunities to even sell, and the only opportunities you get to sell are in your winners, and then if you start selling, you cap your upside effectively.
Yes, I mean, if you have a company that's running if you haven't, the other thing is, this is a bit, okay, we're now going to do the logistics of LP land. I hopefully this is interesting and not painfully geeky. Year 5 of a fund presumes that you invested your capital in your winner in year 1, which it could be you invested in it in year 2 or 3, which means like that company might only be 18 months old. So again, if you know who a winner is in 18 months in, like please call me, right? But for the mere mortals of us, that is hard to know.
Okay.
So it's unlikely that, right? It's unlikely. But what you do see, though, and people, the running meme around this is lemons ripen early. So what you will see are companies theoretically that aren't going to make it, or are pivoting but not landing it, product market fit struggling, whatever the right terminology is. The founders aren't getting along. There could be a myriad of things. And I would say VC's ability to call that early and manage that fine line of balancing what's productively not putting more money in and limiting their time without creating negative feedback loops, because it is a balancing act. Right. But I would say the ability to put your money in your winners and not the ones that are not. You have to be able to read the lie of the die early on. So between the first 5 years, 6 years, those are decisions you're making. And what we've seen, managers that end up with productive DPIs have, I don't have this as a scientific number, but I would say there's probably a higher percentage than not that are good at making that call on where to use their reserves, and are also good at making that call of saying, hey, Beezer, you know what? Maybe this isn't working, and shut the company down. We'll tuck you in somewhere. There's an acqui-hire, but some way of getting their capital, not more of it, but potentially back, and then recycling that. Gotcha. And we haven't seen a ton of loss ratio. This is an ecosystem-wide comment. This is a Europe, Israel, everywhere comment. Because of the availability of capital 2020, 2021, 2022, and even prior to that, our loss ratios were historically low, but there should be a 20 to 30% loss ratio in early stage funds. And I know I'm making a bit of a geek point on this, but that is what people should be starting to see in the first 5 to 6 years, because those are the times you want to take bets. Like, this is early stage investing is a risky category, and it's risky because you should be making great bets, and sometimes great bets don't work, and that's fine. You just don't want to put a ton of capital in them and then not have them.
That makes a lot of sense. I do want to touch on something, and this might be a question for the uninitiated because I don't want to leave anyone hanging here. You mentioned the term recycling. Do you mind elaborating for folks that may not be familiar with recycling? Like, what is recycling and why is that powerful in the world of venture?
Recycling basically just means taking money from an exited company and putting it back into your fund versus distributing it to your LPs. So if David sells his company and let's say you make a couple $1 million on it, which is yay, better than zero, but it's not going to return your fund, and you're in your first 5 to 6 years of your fund life, it's meaningful to recycle it and then invest that in a new company, right? Because what you're trying to do is, your management fee is anywhere from like 2%, 2.5%, right? And that's money you're spending day one. So your fund is only going to be 75 or 80% invested if you don't recycle and take the proceeds back to meet the money you've taken out for your management fee. And the simple thinking on it is, the more shots on goal you take, the higher potential you have. There's a break point when you get over diversified. But if you're taking capital back and you think you can find a couple more investments that have another, 10, 15, 20x potential, 100x if it's really early stage, that money is productive. Versus if you're only 75% invested, when you go to try to hit your carry, maybe your LPA doesn't say this, but most LPAs will say the management fee needs to be returned first. And so you're making up this 20 to 25% debt off the proceeds of your big winners, versus if your big winners don't have to make that up because you've already recycled it, it creates a higher DPI potential because you're just not trying to make your way out of as big of a divot.
Once again, I'll feel free to correct me because I don't have enough whiskers on my beard for this. Usually recycling periods are 3 to 4 years, if I remember correctly. It might be 5 years sometimes, but what are the pros and cons of even thinking about recycling versus distributing the capital back to LPs by like the later stages of a fund, like the latter half of the fund, like year 6, year 7, year 8?
Well, hopefully by then you'll be getting closer to 100%. But I think the challenge usually comes down to if you think of the life of a fund, usually the investment period is only 5 years.
Right.
So they cap it because hypothetically, let's say you recycled and you made a brand new seed investment like year 4 years and 11 months and like 25 days. That seed investment is starting day one, and all your other investments have already started growing. So it just extends everything a lot longer. So it's not that it's negative. It just for LPs that care about IRR, these are all things that just sort of shift these numbers around. And if it's going to be the next great decacorn, is what it is, right?
Gotcha.
But the point of recycling is to pull it in so you can be 100% invested during a window when it'll be useful for the life of the fund, or for reserves because you need to follow on in your winners, which we can have a discussion on a different podcast about, like at what point is following on in your winners actually, if the dollars you're putting in are new, only have a 2 to 5 times X potential because the valuation in your winner is already so high, is that dollar really well spent, or do you put it into another 25 to 50X potential company?
Oh my God, there's so much to chew on there. And we're already over time. But I want to be cognizant of everyone's time here. So I have 2 more questions to kind of close out this episode. Like one of the things that I absolutely love, and the purpose of this podcast is really to demystify the black box of being an LP, but also the humans behind, like the money behind the money, effectively. And you once shared, and I believe this is in Mahendra's book, like The Business of Venture Capital. And this is like, I think you wrote like a couple lines in there, but one of the lines you had in there was, often you don't know if it's you or it's luck. Having humility is essential. And so I'm curious, what keeps you humble today as an LP?
Can't believe it. Did I really write that? That sounds like someone much wiser than me. So glad I wrote that. I think everything keeps me humble. I feel like every time I open up my computer and I read something, there's something to learn, and that I'll spend time with another LP, and I'm like, damn, they looked at it from that perspective. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Or I find everything in venture fascinating. Even sort of slow recessionary times like this, like how does one work through? What's going on? Everything. So all of that keeps me humble, and then especially the good and the bad of being an LP is that you're basically the peanut gallery to the show. So yes, a VC doesn't exist unless LPs back them, but then the LPs are just, we're limited partners. I mean, that word limited is there for a reason. You're not driving the bus. I mean, maybe there's an LP out there who is driving the bus, but most LPs are not driving the bus. So
right.
there's humility in that. Right. And it's sort of like, I liken it to being a parent. I mean, there's all sorts of things you take pride in your kids, but at the end of the day, like, David, it's your fund. It's not me. You're the one making the choices. The same way it's the entrepreneurs that make the companies great.
I love it. And there's always a reminder that we do not know everything in terms of conversing with founders and in terms of conversing with other VCs. I think this business is truly a humbling business as a whole. Speaking of such things, one penultimate question. I promise the last question is like, how do people find you? But I have another question, and this is inspired by a fellow LP friend of mine. What's an opportunity, like investment opportunity, possibly to invest in a fund that you missed out on, not because of what you did, but because of what you didn't do?
I know this is the example you're looking for, and if it's not, we can delete it and start over. But back in the day, and Chris Duvos schooled me on this, I was very upset because I was trying to be a great LP, and someone came to me and I was like, who should be your anchor? XYZ LP, like, you're perfect for their program. They're exactly what you're looking for. Here's how you pitch them. Here's what I'd suggest for your deck, like blah, 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 blah. Helpful. And we also asked for an allocation, and I thought, surely it's like given, since I helped you get your anchor, that I would get my allocation. Like, do I even have to go out and like say that? Turns out, yes. And we did not get our requested allocation. And I was flabbergasted. I'll be honest. I was like, oh, and I went to Chris and he was like, oh, rookie, like, must. he said this with love. We're, brother and sister separated at birth, LP friends. But he was like, no, you have to confirm your allocation before, doing these things because the GP, like, it's their business to choose. And I get it. I see all sides of it. But that was something that was one of my learning curves, because I just presumed if one was super helpful, why would then have to say, but I'm doing this because you will hold my spot?
Before doing it, is it literally just like, hey, I will introduce you to X individuals if you give me allocation if they invest, right? Or is it, if I help you with this thing, I would love it.
I don't think it's quite as quid pro quo, but okay. Because the anchor they were looking for was writing significantly, like the overall fund could have accommodated the anchor that came in with probably a 2.5x check to what we were writing or asking for. And then our check. So my math was, well, there's plenty of room for both. So again, I was like, hey, we write this size check. So it, like, this isn't like secret, right? But this person is who you want to anchor. And when they anchor it, you can then do X, Y, and Z and build on this, because even just the two of us alone wouldn't have given them the fund size they wanted. Like, they were going for another 50%. So to get the LP ball rolling, you need an anchor sometimes. And so I was trying to set them up on here's how you get your fundraising momentum. So so apparently there was this other sentence, which was, hey, but I would like to know that you're would be giving us this allocation as I make this introduction, right? Like, help me out, whatever. However I was supposed to have said it. Clearly I didn't say it right. But that was something I didn't do. So I'm sharing on my LP best practice to other people. But I also think the GP could have also gone back and said, hey, I'm getting all this interest. Can we talk about your check size? It shouldn't have been. There's definitely, and I appreciate it's like LP Tetris when funds get a lot of momentum in fundraising, and it can be very fast and furious. And just like with GPs and entrepreneurs, you need to stay on it. And you can't presume that people will remember your check size request or remember you and all those things. But I find there's definitely the waiting to the last minute to know what your check size is very stressful. And it's very common when funds get a lot of momentum, and it's just part of the nature of the business, but it's very stressful.
I can imagine. That's such a good lesson. And I can't imagine a better lesson to end on than that one. Thank you so much. As one last thing, obviously you're on all the socials, you have OpenLP, but if folks want to find you, either LPs or GPs, what's the best way to do so?
My DMs are open, so feel free to DM me. But and I will admit this, I'm not great on the LinkedIn messages because there's only so many platforms I can go to, and DM somehow finds my phone better. But I really prefer email because I travel a lot. And so I work in a very asynchronous information environment, and relying on United Wi-Fi is challenging. So email me, Beezer at Sapphire Ventures, and I'm not always immediate on my responses because, again, I get backlogged in travel. But I keep it there to sort of get back to it. And then knowing what the question is, I have to admit, I really appreciate it when people say, hey, here's what I'd like to talk about, and to be as specific as someone's comfortable sharing, because I'm sure it works for different people, but just saying, hey, can we have 15 minutes to talk? I don't know how to prioritize that on hey, this is a really time-sensitive question I'm burning on, or hey, I kind of want to just chat theoretically about something and we can fit this in 2 months from now, 3 months from now. Like, David, you've been very patient with me. Again, because of the traveling, my schedule becomes very lumpy.
So appreciate that. And I'm sure people, after listening to this, when this launches, may have many follow-up questions which we did not have time to cover. And that might be a good impetus to a good cold email coming in your inbox. Beezer?
Correct, but yes. I would say I also have a very soft spot in my heart for people that say, hey, I looked on OpenLP and here's what I found. And then I have a follow-up question because there's so many great resources out there. We try to collect them, but also other ones like the nuances on recycling and distributions. We of course spend a lot of time understanding our data and what we see as best practices, but I do these kind of things to do a many-to-many conversation. Those are a little bit harder as well, to be honest.
Beezer, thank you so much. I so wish we had more time, but maybe we'll save that for an episode too. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you. This is awesome. Thank you for having me.
Hello, Superclusters fans. You've seen the logo at the beginning, and now we're here to address the elephant in the room. And the big question is, how intertwined is Superclusters and Alchemist Accelerator? And the truth is, Superclusters and Alchemist Accelerator are two completely separate entities, other than the fact that it is only I, David, your host, who is able to traverse between the multiverses. And so the reason Alchemist is a sponsor for Superclusters is the same reason why I ended up joining Alchemist. And it's for two reasons: the team and the product. So let me elaborate a little bit. For the team side, I was doing a bunch of diligence, homework, reference checks before I joined Alchemist, and I stumbled across a story which was between Ravi and an early team member of Alchemist. And for the sake of this story, I'm going to call that person John. So Ravi and John were working late at night because they had a deadline coming up, and as they were about to leave, Ravi found out that John didn't have a place to stay and had been sleeping out of his car the entire time. And the next thing Ravi did literally blew my mind, which was Ravi gave the keys to his place to John and said, "John, you're free to stay here for as long as you want." And I knew instantly that this is the team I wanted to join. This is the culture I wanted to be a part of. The second thing is the product itself. Alchemist has built this really robust product called the Vault, and it is the epitome of Peter Drucker's infamous line, which is, "You cannot manage what you don't measure." And so for the uninitiated, what is Alchemist Accelerator? Alchemist Accelerator is your startup accelerator for companies that monetize from enterprises. And so don't take it just from me. We've backed incredible companies, including names you've heard of: LaunchDarkly, Prevacera, MoEngage, and we're also backed by some incredible LPs and investors, including Khosla Ventures, Mayfield, Salesforce. And now, between you and I can't share any of the numbers, and if I do, our compliance officer, will literally gobble me up for breakfast, lunch, afternoon tea, and dinner. And personally, I'm too young to die. But I will say, the numbers, they're great. Like, they're really great. And so if you're curious and want to get involved in Alchemist and the ecosystem, check out alchemistaccelerator.com/superclusters. And that's superclusters with an S at the beginning and at the S at the end. And we'll also include these links in the notes. Hey Superclusters fans, this is David from Post, and want to share a few things before you go. If you're tuning in from the YouTube universe, and if you like this episode and if you want to see more of it, consider subscribing. It's free. Let us know down in the comments which LPs you'd want to see next, or topics you liked and want to hear more of. If you're tuning in from the audio universe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever content finds your ear, and you liked what you heard, give us a follow. And lastly, want to share a quick disclaimer from our legal friends. While I am the head of investor relations at Alchemist Accelerator, and that Alchemist Accelerator is one of our proud sponsors, the views expressed in this episode are for informational purposes only and are solely the views of myself and the guest alone. They are not representative of Alchemist Accelerator. None of the views expressed herein constitute legal, investment, business, or tax advice, and any allusions or references to funds or companies are purely for illustrative purposes only and should not be relied upon as investment recommendations. Consult a professional investment advisor near you prior to making any investment decisions. And that's all from me. See you on the next.